Welcome to the VCA Voice Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Marie Kerl. Join us as we dive into inspirational stories about our caring and capable associates and their commitment to guiding healing journeys for our patients. Our discussions explore the important ways VCA Animal Hospitals proactively supports the future of veterinary medicine through leading the industry in medical excellence and providing hometown care to our communities. Welcome to part 2 of our 2-part series on the Recover 2.0 initiative. Listen in as we continue our conversation with Drs. Burkitt, Boller, and Fletcher. Dan, I'm very happy to say that we have many VCA associates who are Recover Responder Rescuer certified and some who are instructor certified. Were the educational products and certifications always a part of the Recover plan, or was it that the guidelines were developed and then it was like, oh no, we're going to have to do something to teach people this? How did that happen?
Yeah, it was definitely from the very beginning. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, this started because I had an interest in trying to develop standardized CPR training. And it hadn't occurred to me at that initial time that we would need to do this whole evidence evaluation process to develop those guidelines. It was Manu's insight that we really needed to do that really got us to the point where we could develop these guidelines. So education has been on our minds since the very beginning. And I think equally importantly, research has been on our minds since the very beginning.
Right.
I think one of the major products of the first round and now this second round of the Recover guidelines has been identification of knowledge gaps. And there are lots of them. There are lots of things that we don't really have good, strong evidence to support in terms of how best to do CPR. And so another really important part of the Recover initiative is fostering that research and trying to encourage people to answer these questions. So yeah, education has been on the docket from the very beginning. And from my perspective, I can only give you my perspective. For me, it was important. You know, you think about your dentist is probably CPR certified, right? Because really any human healthcare professional has to have CPR certification. That's not been the case in veterinary medicine. And I think that's contributed to low success rates we've seen in veterinary CPR. So I do think that education piece is really critical, and having an ability for someone to have a motivation to take a CPR course. I mentioned our evangelists, and we have lots of evangelists. We love our evangelists, and they're doing a remarkable job getting the word out. But I won't rest until every technician and every veterinarian and every general practice in the world is comfortable doing CPR, because what we have learned time and time again when we look at the literature is that if we start CPR right away, if we do good quality CPR, and if the patient had a cardiopulmonary arrest because of something sudden and reversible, like say a bad reaction to an anesthetic drug, and every veterinarian in general practice is going to be using anesthetic drugs, we know that we can have really excellent success rates, and we can get these patients back and get them back home to their families. So we, in the ivory tower here at Cornell, we see a lot of very, very sick patients, and we do CPR frequently, but our success rates aren't great, and they're never going to be, because we see these really sick patients. But wouldn't it be awesome if everyone who's listening to this podcast, if when they took their dog to the vet to have her spayed, if that team was ready, so in that off chance that something goes a little bit wrong during that anesthesia, not through anyone's fault, but because sometimes animals have weird reactions to drugs, that team is ready to jump into action, and that dog goes home. That's a remarkable thing to think about. So I think that education piece and really making sure that every single veterinary health professional knows how to do this as well as possible has the potential to save many, many, many lives, and, to keep many, many families whole. So that's a huge motivator for me.
Jamie, tell me how you decided to become involved in Recover 2.0 as a co-chair.
Dan and Manu approached me. I don't know the backstory behind this, but I assume that they had recognized that this was going to be an enormous undertaking.
But they didn't tell you that initially, right?
They probably did, although I don't remember that specifically. But okay. I know that they had realized that the educational piece was really taking off. Mm-hmm. There was a new registry for different hospitals to be registering their different CPR events for the purpose of research, so that we can fill some of the knowledge gaps that we have regarding CPR in dogs and cats. And Dan and Manu were both deeply involved in both of those tasks. And I think probably looked forward to the fact that we needed to update the guidelines. And so I was fortunate enough that I fell somewhere on that list that I was contacted and I said, yes, I would love to do that. I did at the time have 2 large projects already going, neither of which had anything to do with CPR. And so it was definitely a shift for me toward this path in my career and getting those other projects tied up as well to make sure that I had the bandwidth to do all the tasks and recover. So, I mean, this was an easy decision for me, though. This is an initiative that I really believed in before I became a co-chair. So I was humbled and excited to be asked and have really enjoyed doing this and the growth that it's allowed me professionally and personally.
That's wonderful. So, Dan, compared to the 2012 Recover process, what was different with the Recover 2.0 project?
Yeah, we bit off a lot with
I remember all
round.
The emails.
Yeah, it took a little bit more time to pull this one off. So we, again, took advantage of the fact that Manuel especially has some really great connections in the human resuscitation community. And they really helped us sort of figure out what this next step should look like. So in the first round, we followed the same process they had in the previous CPR guidelines. What the folks who do the human CPR guidelines switched to was a process called GRADE, but it is an extremely robust process for this specific task, which is looking at evidence and trying to develop clinical guidelines based on that evidence. There are a large number of organizations in human medicine that use this process now. I would say the majority of clinical guidelines that are published these days in human medicine are using this new, very robust process. I'm very proud to say that we are the first in veterinary medicine to use it. I'm also very tired because we used it. So I'm very happy we did it. And I think that we learned a lot through this process that we're hoping that other organizations will take what we learned and be able to do this as well, because I do think it is the way to do evidence-based guidelines. It is a very rigorous and specific approach to taking a whole bunch of studies that seem relevant to a question that you're asking and to dissect those studies and to really tease out any kinds of aspects of those studies that might affect the quality of the evidence that you can pull from that to answer your question. And so it's quite a transparent process. We had to develop an entire online system to make that happen, and a custom, basically web-based system that allowed us to present all of the questions that needed to be answered to each evidence evaluator. Mm-hmm. And this time around, we had over 240 people involved in answering these questions. And for every question that we asked, we had 2 different individuals look at this same evidence and answer these same questions, whereas the first time we only had 1. So it was a very robust approach.
Jamie, give me an idea of the size and scope of this project. I know Dan shared the number of subject matter experts that were involved, but the literature that was being reviewed compared to what was available in the 2012 Recover guidelines.
The 2.0 project did involve all those subject matter experts, but the thing that I feel like our initiative sort of has up our sleeve maybe is that although 5 papers were published in June of 2024, we have 5 more domains where we have our evidence evaluated and have not yet gotten those papers published yet. They're all in process currently. So really, although 240 or so subject matter experts were involved in the whole project, the papers that have been published so far encompass maybe about 100 of those subject matter experts, give or take. Mm-hmm. And these are specialist veterinarians as well as specialist technicians, veterinary technician and nurse specialists, basically, who helped in this process. We also had a set of specialist librarians who helped us optimize our literature searches. So about a handful of information specialists, which are specialist librarians, helped us to actually find the articles we were going to look at. And some of these searches for an individual question, and there are approximately 50 questions that were answered among the 3 main domain papers in the first release here in June of 24. Mm-hmm. And in those 3 papers, of all 50 questions, there were certain individual questions that were pulling maybe 2,000 or more articles that were relevant potentially. We tried to whittle it down to as few as 50 or fewer per question. And then ideally, as few as maybe 10 to 20 really, really germane topical pieces of evidence or papers that helped us to answer each question. But anyway, we're talking about tens of thousands of articles that ultimately were sort of skimmed and at least title and abstract reviewed to kind of decide what to use for the project. So it was enormous in scope. I think probably bigger than any of us thought that it would be, and certainly more than we'd hoped for. we got ourselves to what we hoped is the most relevant information to actually put through that specialized system that Dan described.
I really appreciate hearing about how thorough the process is and the depth at which the three of you and the subject matter experts went to be able to get the best answers given the information that we have right now. So that's wonderful. You mentioned veterinary technicians, and of course, all of us recognize the crucial importance of credentialed veterinary technicians and veterinary technician specialists in veterinary medicine. Do you have an idea of how many technicians were involved in this effort, and how did they receive being involved and asked for their expertise?
Yeah, that's a great question. And first, I feel like I should answer regarding veterinary technicians and nurses, the fact that although we are the three co-chairs of this project, our executive committee involves a fourth member who's Ken Yagi, a veterinary technician, a nurse specialist, who informs all of our decision-making at kind of the organizational level and has significant input on every one of our pillars. So we really are committed to the inclusion of veterinary technicians and technician specialists and the veterinary nursing community in general. As far as the specific numbers for that, I actually am going to defer to Dan.
Okay.
I would guess probably maybe a quarter of the evidence evaluators were veterinary technician specialists. So it was a reasonable number.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and certainly going through the spreadsheets, thanks for that, Dan, that would be my impression as well, based on the names. Because at this point, we're quite familiar with all of our evidence evaluators by name. We know them well from all the information they've given us. So that would be my impression as well, probably a 20 to 25% or so. And we'll have them continue to be involved as evidence evaluators. And also, moving forward, we're going to be doing some translations of the guidelines again. So the guidelines paper itself will be translated, we're hoping, this quarter into as many as 16 target languages that we have so far. And Ken has helped us to find veterinary technicians and nurses from all these international sites to be able to proofread and evaluate the guidelines to make sure that from a technical perspective, the instructions in the guidelines, or the guidelines in the guidelines, as it were, are pertinent where they live in practice. So veterinary technicians and technician specialists will remain really important in this process.
Manu, what are the major changes in the recommendations for veterinary CPR in the updated Recover guidelines?
Thanks very much for that question. I think you could reword it and say, was all that work that you did actually worth it?
or were the first recommendations pretty good? It didn't need a lot of change.
Yeah, right. Yes, and also, the reasons why we repeated that is that there's new evidence coming out, right? So we wanted to update those things, but then, even if we knew that there was no significant new evidence, we wanted to apply this new rigorous process, the great process that Dan suggested, to all of the questions. So that's what made it so large, right? As mentioned before, I think the most important thing that still is standing out, and it remains like that, like a rock in the stormy sea, is the importance of chest compression quality, right? So that is, after, what is it now, 15 years, almost 14 years later, it's still the most important thing. And maybe we found ways to emphasize that a little bit more in the new guidelines. So one of which is that we set a higher target rate for end-tidal CO2. So end-tidal CO2 is a measurement of exhaled carbon dioxide. And this is a correlate to how much blood flow is generated during chest compressions. So a higher end-tidal CO2 suggests more efficacious chest compressions. So the previous target was 15 millimeters of mercury, to be specific. The new target is at least 18 millimeters of mercury. And what that emphasizes is that we really need to try to generate as much blood flow as possible during those chest compressions to maintain the cerebral and the cardiac function of those animals to the best of our abilities. It's crucial for not just return of spontaneous circulation, but for an acceptable functional outcome at the end of the day. Like, how well is the animal doing? How well can it return to its previous quality of life, right? As a family member. So that's really important that stayed exactly the same. We made some other important changes regarding chest compressions, and that mostly affects small dogs of less than 7 kilograms and cats, where we changed the recommendations for how we administer chest compressions themselves. The previous recommendation was to use basically a similar approach as in the larger animals, using both arms and hands. And the new approaches are slightly different. They really emphasize that we compress the ventricles directly with just one hand in one way or another. And squeezing those ventricles allows cardiac output to be generated that is most close to what we would achieve in a spontaneously beating heart. And so that's tremendously important in those small animals where it's so easy, relatively speaking, because the chests are soft, right, to squeeze those ventricles. And it has a tremendous, tremendous impact. So I think that was a really important change. And then there are some other things. We changed dogs that are flat-chested to call them now wide-chested. And also changed a little bit how we start CPR in them. So we now recommend to start chest compressions in lateral recumbency in those wide-chested animals, so typically English bulldogs or the like, and also intubate them in that position, which is a little bit easier. Intubation for those animals is of the utmost importance, right? Because if you cannot ventilate them effectively, those animals are lost. There's no way that we get them back. So that was a little bit a recommendation that targets that problem. We also now introduced bag mask ventilation as the prioritized approach to ventilation of animals that are not intubated. And part of that is because you can't give oxygen. So newer studies in the meantime showed that ability to administer supplemental oxygen during CPR might actually lead to preferential, more normal oxygenation in the arterial blood of those animals when using bag mask ventilation as opposed to mouth to nose ventilation, which was the previous recommendation. And also is a testament a little bit to the heightened awareness of infectious diseases. And maybe COVID contributed to some extent to that, but I think there's also regional areas where, for example, rabies is a problem. And for those rescuers there, it's tremendously important to keep them safe. So we really developed much more easy to follow and clear operational definitions of those terms that make it, I would say, clearer, easier for the resuscitators to follow without that previous concerns on what exactly actually needs to be done.
Dan, what are 2 or 3 areas where we still have unanswered questions in veterinary CPR, and what is Recover undertaking to fill those knowledge gaps?
I think it's a great opportunity to talk about the approach as well, right? So I think one of the things that differentiated the Recover guidelines from some of the other maybe consensus statements or guidelines processes that are out there is we didn't really feel we had the luxury of not making a recommendation about something, say, as critical as how fast should you compress the chest and how deeply should you compress the chest. So we had to make a recommendation, and we had to make that recommendation in the face of very, very minimal evidence. And so a lot of the recommendations in the current guidelines are based on what we know in human medicine, what we know from some experimental studies that maybe are in our species and maybe aren't in our species and often aren't really targeted at the questions we're trying to answer. And then we have to take our knowledge of anatomy and physiology and then try to reach consensus among this panel of experts to actually make a recommendation. And so that's all a long way of saying that there are a lot of the things that are really the bread and butter of doing CPR. We made recommendations and we are very transparent in the guidelines about what the evidence is to support it. And in many of them, the evidence is very low because the studies just haven't been done. So things as simple, Manu, I think, did a beautiful job of really explaining how important chest compressions are. We think that without question, chest compressions are the most important part of CPR. If we can't get that blood flowing, there's no way we're getting this patient back because we're not getting any oxygen into the tissues. And the reality is that if you look at what literature is available, we really don't know exactly where in the chest we should push in any dog or cat. We don't know how deeply we should push. We probably know a little bit better how fast we should push because we have some pretty good experimental evidence about that. But some of the basic fundamental aspects of where on the chest to focus the compression, we make recommendations based on anatomy and physiology that we understand about these patients, but there really haven't been studies to answer those questions. So I think some of the low-hanging fruit in terms of studies that we need to see done are things like, if you have a dog like a greyhound that has a very narrow chest, where should you push on the chest? Should you push directly over the heart? Should you push in some other part of the chest? If you have a dog like a Labrador that has a really round chest, a completely different chest conformation, where should you push in that patient? Should you push over the heart? Should you push in some other location? So some of those really fundamental things we don't have specific answers to. We make our best recommendations and we give people a starting point and recommend that they move around on the chest if that's not working. I think that those are studies that we really want to see done, and we want to try to figure out ways to answer those questions. We're very grateful that we've had some success in our online courses and our in-person courses, and we've managed to generate some revenue by selling those courses. And so every year we fund research studies through the American College of Veterinary Emergency and Critical Care that are targeted at CPR research. And one of the things that we're working on right now to try to hone that in a little bit more is to actually each year when that grant comes out, what we'd like to do is to have specific areas of focus that we think are important based on this evidence evaluation process we just went through, so that we can hopefully encourage all those folks out there who are really good researchers to start to focus on some of these questions that we identified during the evidence evaluation process. And that identification of knowledge gaps, as I mentioned earlier, is something that was a really important part of this whole process, is what do we not know the answer to?
Right.
So I think that that those research projects are really important. I think the guidelines themselves, which have each individual question we asked, has a specific section focused on knowledge gaps. What could we not answer definitively based on the study? What are the high priority things? So all of that is now published, which we hope will help serve as a bit of a research roadmap for folks who are interested in doing this work. So I think the funding and the identification of those knowledge gaps are probably the most important things that we're doing as a group to try to address some of these gaps.
Jamie, what about the next 1 to 2 years for Recover? What lies ahead?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we're deep in it. So like Dan just mentioned, under Manuel's pillar of research, we do have the registry, and we have many studies being submitted from the different centers involved in that registry. So we are, in fact, learning more and more all the time, have really valuable information coming out from that registry. So that's great. And every year we'll be funding, at least one grant to help fill some of these knowledge gaps. So we know that on the research side. Educationally, Dan has a lot of courses in the works as well, just released new basic and advanced life support online courses.
I know. I just got the notice that the online courses were updated.
They're ready
it's
to
amazing.
go. So now anyone who wants to learn, a veterinarian or veterinary technician who wants to become certified in CPR or recertified in CPR, has updated guidelines information available to them in those courses. And there are additional courses coming out as well, post-cardiac arrest care, first aid courses in the works as well. So that's what's happening on the educational front. And then from a guidelines perspective, we do have 5 domains from the 2.0 evidence evaluation push. Newborn is, I would say, more than halfway done. We're just finalizing the drafting of the newborn guidelines, which is exciting. A draft of a newborn algorithm for resuscitation is already put together and has sort of made appearances here and there at different conferences and such, will also be published along with those newborn guidelines. And we also have a new kind of subdomain of the monitoring domain and point of care ultrasound, the use of point of care ultrasound in the peri-arrest and cardiopulmonary resuscitation space. So they're also just about to start evidence evaluation in Q1 of 2025. So we're really looking forward to that as well. So at all kind of levels of the project, we have people at the very beginning for some PICO questions, in the middle for some, and Manu and I trying to wrap up the newborn ones, hopefully for early in 2025.
And we'll put a link in the show notes to how to access all of the different training materials that are available, so that if listeners are looking for those, they'll have an easy way to be able to find them and get the information that they need. You've mentioned the registry now a couple of times, and that is an online site where people can record what happened during a cardiac arrest and cardiac resuscitation. And that's a global initiative, right?
Yeah, they are for the most part in North America. There are some European centers as well. The registry is in English only at the current time. So that's a little bit of a limitation. But yes, anybody who reaches out to us and submits an expression of interest will be informed of what it entitles to participate in the registry. It's in principle open to everybody. And what Dan said initially, right, that many of those studies come out of hospitals with only severely affected non-anesthetic arrests. We really hope to have a much more representative overview on what's happening there regarding resuscitation out in the world. And so everybody's welcome to contribute.
And if people are interested in participating, is that information also accessible through the Recover website?
Correct.
Sadly, we're nearing the end of our time together. And before we close, I first want to express my gratitude to all of you, as well as the entire Recover team, Ken, and all of the contributors for making such a significant contribution to veterinary medicine and life-saving evidence-based patient care. In closing, do you have any words of advice for aspiring veterinary clinician scientists about forging new pathways? Jamie?
I think my perspective on this would be to always consider what the future could hold and not to let decisions you've made in the past constrain you. If I had turned down the opportunity to work with the Recover Initiative this deeply because I was in the middle of a textbook and had just launched a randomized controlled clinical trial, which probably would have been the sane decision, I wouldn't be in the position I'm in today to be doing some of the most exciting work I've done in my career. And really, I hope making an impact for veterinarians, veterinary technicians, patients, and clients. We really hope that everyone benefits from the work that we're trying to do. So, looking forward to what it could be rather than being too constrained about decisions that were made in the past that might complicate that would be my main advice, I think.
Dan?
I think the thing that has been remarkable to me through this journey is this community that we're all a part of. This community is really remarkable. And I think what has amazed me is, we have this ridiculously daunting task that we decided to try to get across the finish line. And it's been remarkable to me how many people just jump up and say, yes, I want to help. And I think that for me, that sort of reinforced this idea that we have a community that is very tight-knit, that is very open and very collaborative. And I think if you have an idea for something that you want, or you just need support for whatever reason, it can be really hard to ask for help. But I would encourage everyone out there listening, if you're in this veterinary professional community, to really be aware of the fact that people are out there and really want to see exciting things happen. And they're just cool people who want to work with you. And I think there's no way we could have done this without this whole community that grew up around it. And I would love to see that community tapped for all kinds of other great things that we could do as a profession.
And Manu, what would you have to say to aspiring clinician scientists?
I think, maybe on a more individual basis, I think it's really important to be bold and be inspired and passionate about following what your heart tells you to do without necessarily worrying too much about what kind of consequences that it could have, whether it's going to fail or not. I feel very strongly that Dan and I did not know what's coming out of Recover when we started. And I think that if we would have known, maybe we wouldn't have done it. Just because it's too daunting and too, what I mean? Not just a workload, it's just too big of a thing, right? It's wow.
Huge.
And so we just did it, as I said, out of a certain naivety. And I think that's a good place to be. And I think one should embrace that as long as you reach out to other peers and do it collaboratively. As Dan said, we're not alone. There's so many people that know so much more than each individual of us, right? And tapping into that community is incredibly important. Makes it more robust. It's easier for each individual one, and the outcome is so much better. And we all work together, and we are successful together.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. It has been my absolute pleasure to both hear your stories and learn about your passion and talk about this vital work. So thank you all so much.
Thank you very much for having us. It was a great pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Marie. It's been great.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. We hope you enjoyed it and learned a few helpful tips. If you haven't already, I encourage you to subscribe and listen to our previous episodes to hear the many valuable insights and lessons from our past guests. Don't forget to leave a review for today's episode and share with friends. Make sure to follow VCA Animal Hospitals on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram to stay in the loop. For more inspiring stories, visit our website at vcavoice.com.